Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous, and this is part 57 in a 10-part video series in which we are learning how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. If you haven't seen the previous 3 videos, I suggest you go back to part 54, watch from there, and I'll see you here again shortly. For those of you who have seen the previous videos, let's continue our discussion about how to determine what type of variables to use when creating Orchestrator workflows. And specifically, what we're going to be doing is talking about some design patterns that you're oftentimes going to see. Now, you'll recall in the previous video, we left off discussing this flowchart. I'm not going to go through the whole flowchart again. If you want to hear about the flowchart, go watch the previous video. But in this video, we're going to talk about what I was mentioning here in this lower right-hand corner of our flowchart. So as you can see here, it says we're going to add a final schema element to copy attributes to output parameters. Now, that's a common design pattern. Another common design pattern is adding a schema element, a scriptable task, at the beginning of your Orchestrator workflow to copy input parameters to attributes. Not all the input parameters, just the input parameters whose values we want to change. So again, 2 related design patterns, one that takes place at the beginning of your Orchestrator workflow, one that takes place at the end of your Orchestrator workflow. Let's take a look at our lab environment and see how these design patterns work. Okay, here in my lab environment, as you can see, I have a simple workflow. Only has a few schema elements in it, and all this workflow is going to do is to take a number that the user is going to specify as an input parameter. It's going to multiply that number by 10, and it's going to log the new value. Now, to do this, as you can see, I have already created an input parameter. And to make really clear which type of variable I'm working with at different points in this workflow, I've given them really obvious names. So I have this input parameter here called input parameter. It holds a number, and the point of that input parameter is to ask the user to pick their favorite number. That's the number that we're going to multiply by 10. So if we look at our schema, the first schema element that we see here, the scriptable task, essentially wants to take the input parameter, the number that the user specified in the input parameter, and multiply it times 10. And then store that new value in the input parameter variable. Now, this is not going to work for several reasons. One of the reasons it's not going to work is because these variables inside my code, called input parameter, look very much like the input parameter that I created earlier. They have the exact same name, but this input parameter here and this local variable here that happens to have the exact same name are not the same variable. One is an input parameter that's known to the workflow. The other that we see right here on the screen is a local variable that's visible only within this schema element. So what I need to do is some parameter binding. So I'm going to go to the Visual Binding tab. We can do this multiple ways. You can learn about the other ways in earlier videos in this series. But if I go to the Visual Binding tab, I can bring in, by creating an inward binding, I can bring in the input parameter. Again, the input parameter from my workflow. So now my workflow variable called input parameter and the schema elements local variable called input parameter are bound to each other. So now if I go to the code, as you can see here, my variable names are no longer black because I have binding set up, and the code looks like it's going to work great. However, if we run this workflow, it's not going to work so great. And let me actually illustrate that in action. So I'm going to actually run this workflow, and I'm going to run it through the debugger. I don't actually need to run it through the debugger, but you'll see in a moment why I'm doing that. I'm going to type in my favorite number is 123, and I'm going to submit this workflow. And as this workflow runs, it runs happily. As we can see, it's reached the end of the workflow. Let me show you that's the case. There we go. There's the end. So we reached the end. But notice, once the workflow is done running, the value of the input parameter is still 123. What I wanted it to be was, if I multiplied it times 10, this number should have been 1230, not 123.0, but 1230. So what's happened here is that while we were in this scriptable task, this schema element, the value of the variable was indeed was multiplied times 10. It did that successfully, but the problem is that we lose that change when we exit this schema element. So even though we've locally changed the value of this variable called input parameter, we lose that change outside of the schema element. And the reason why is that the inward binding that we set up is allowing us to successfully see the value that's in the variable. So we've got read only permission on the variable, so we can see what's in the variable, but we cannot change the value of the variable because the variable is read-only. Doing a command, a statement such as you see here where we're saying variable equals something, always requires that we have an outward binding. We don't have that. So if we try to set up an outward binding, it would seem kind of strange to have a variable called input parameter and set up an outward binding, but if you ignore that fact, we simply can't do it anyways. If I go to visual binding, if I want to set up an outward binding, that would result in a line somewhere over here, either to an output parameter or an attribute, but I can't do it because this section here is blank. There's no way to feed, even if I try, there's no way to set up an outward binding to the variable called input parameter because I don't see it here, I don't see it here, I don't even see a variable here. So what we're going to need to do is to take a different approach. Let me resize things a little bit here, and we're going to try this again. I'm going to revert the workflow back to its previous state. So in the previous state, I have that input parameter called input parameter, and my schema is back to having no bindings. I have a binding. Let me get rid of that binding. I didn't expect to have that binding. As an added bonus here, I'm showing you how to clean up your mess. There we go. So this schema element that's supposed to multiply the input parameter by 10 has no inward binding anymore. I have the input parameter itself, but it's not being brought in. So to handle the problem that we've just demonstrated here, what I'm going to do is drag in another scriptable task. I'm going to place it at the beginning of my workflow. This is, by the way, a very common design pattern. You'll oftentimes see a schema element at the beginning of the workflow that's going to copy the value of one or more input parameters to attributes. That way, the attributes will have the value. I can work with the attribute, not only seeing its value, but I can also change the value of the attribute. So now that I've done that, I'm going to need an attribute. But as you can see, I've already created an attribute called attribute. Like the input parameter, it's a number. The types are going to need to match here. And I'm not going to bother to set the value because the schema element I'm creating is going to set the value. And the whole purpose of this attribute is going to be to allow me to copy the input parameter's value into an attribute. And since it's an attribute, it's read-write. I can see what's in it. I can change what's in it. So to do that, what I'm going to do in my schema is I'm going to go to this first schema element, and I'm going to bring in the input parameter. And I'm going to set up an outward binding to the attribute. Now I'm not quite done. I'm almost done. I'm going to type just a little bit of code here. I'm going to go to the scripting tab and type a little bit of code. I'm simply going to say attribute equals the input parameter. So I was never going to be able to change the value of the input parameter because it's an input parameter, it's read-only. But now that I've copied input parameter's value to an attribute, I can use that attribute within any schema element that I want within the workflow. I can bring in that attribute to see its value, and I can also have an outward binding to attribute to save it. So for instance, back here in our schema element that's supposed to multiply the number times 10, what we're going to do is we'll go to visual binding and we'll simply bring in the attribute. That's going to allow me to see what the value is so that I can multiply it. But additionally, I plan to change the value of the variable. Again, I'm going to multiply it times 10. That means I'm going to change it. So I need an outward binding to that variable. So once I've done that, the code actually becomes pretty simple. It's going to look a lot like this, but instead of input parameter, I'm going to say attribute equals attribute times 10. By the way, you may have noticed I clicked attribute down here both times. It doesn't matter which of these you click. Clicking here is just simply going to insert whatever the name of whatever variable I'm clicking in. I don't have to type, I don't have to click attribute for this one and this attribute for that one. It doesn't matter. If you want to do that way, that's fine. But now I have code that is going to read what's in the value, the variable called attribute, and it's going to multiply it times 10, and then it's going to take that value and assign that value. It's going to write that value to the same variable. So at that point, if I run this workflow, again, I'm simply running it through the debugger so that I can see the variables tab. I'm going to submit this workflow. Again, I'm saying 123. Actually, why don't we change that number just to make it really obvious that this is a different run. I'm going to say 456 is my favorite number, and this time when I run the workflow, because I copied the input parameter to an attribute and then I'm doing the math on the attribute, you'll notice that the input parameter is the original value, 456, which will never change because it can never change. It's an input parameter. You're not allowed to change them. But our attribute, on the other hand, is indeed 10 times as big. The attribute value is 4560.0, also known as 4560, which is 10 times the original number. So excellent. This is working great for us now. But we still had more to our workflow. We also want to log that. We want to log the value of the variable. So once again, in the logging portion of this workflow, I'm going to bring in the attribute, not the input parameter, because its value is still 456. I want to log the new value. So I'm bringing in the attribute with an inward binding. And I'm not going to set up any outward bindings because I'm not going to do anything to the variable called attribute. I'm not multiplying it. I'm not changing it. So I don't need an outward binding. So with this binding, I should be able to put in some code that says something exciting like system.log attribute, and that code will work. But what I really want to show you, though, is the next step. So at the beginning of this demonstration, I showed you this first scriptable task is copying an input parameter to an attribute. It's not copying all the input parameters, just the ones I plan to change. And here at the end of my workflow, I want to do essentially the same sort of thing, but in reverse. What I want to do this time, and again, this is a common design pattern. At the end of your workflow, you drag in a scriptable task. You give it a more descriptive name like copy attribute to output parameter. Let me scroll over so you can see what I typed. And again, this is essentially the same thing. I just have to set it up a little differently. I'm going to go to visual binding. I'm going to bring in the attribute value. That way I can see what the value is. Again, in our example, the value would be 4,560. And I'm going to save that variable's value in an output parameter. So I'm setting up an outward binding to my output parameter. Now again, I need a little bit of code here, but once again, the code is very simple. I'm going to go to the scripting tab and say that the output parameter is equal to whatever's in that attribute. And I'm done. And to show you it working, let me run the workflow. Again, to distinguish from other workflow runs, I'll say my favorite number is 789. I run the workflow. And whereas before output number was blank, notice this time when I run the workflow, the output parameter has been set to the value 7,890. Do you have ideas for other videos that you'd like to see? If you do, drop me a comment down in the YouTube comments and let me know. What do you want to talk about? What sort of Orchestrator topics do you have? Or what sort of things in Orchestrator are driving you crazy? Let me know in the YouTube comments down below.